Good morning. Every Lent, at least one of our readings will be about the story of Jesus being tempted 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. It echoes, of course, the Moses story of wandering in the wilds for 40 years before finding the so-called Promised Land, which of course was Canaanite land. And you, like me, have probably heard more than a few sermons on this Matthean temptation text over the years. Jesus tempted by a literal devil to use his Superman powers to meet his own needs, impress others, and get the powers that be, also known as the kingdoms of the world, subservient to him. Just as the devil is a literary creation, not a literal creation, so these temptations were created by the emergent church to reflect what they, Jesus' followers, were being tempted by. Namely, using their faith not to primarily serve others, but to serve themselves. Not primarily to help little people by doing little things, but to impress big people by doing big things. And not to be primarily wary of power over others, but to seek it. Maybe we too, like our forebears, need to create mythological stories today to remind us of our key values and their flip sides. Of course, mythological stories can have difficulties for us. They reflect the literary style of the author or authors and can become literalized. Take Mr. Devil, for example. A large number of Christians over the centuries have, and some still do, believe that this demigod literally exists. So their misdeeds, their desires, aren't actually their own, but the result of a foreign anti-God being who is leading them astray. And time and again, Christian leaders and communities have projected out their fears and prejudices and made groups, cultures, including women, emissaries of the devil. The stereotyped facial caricature of Jews, for example, was used and is still used in some places as the facial caricature of the devil. Our first reading today from Genesis 2 is a mythological story with huge difficulties. Frankly, the story of Adam, Eve, the talking snake, and the apple of supposedly great wisdom is one of those myths from long ago that needs to be kept in the dusty section of an old library and stay there. But alas, alack, it didn't and doesn't. Firstly, please note, like the 40 days and 40 nights, this story never happened. It's not history. Secondly, this story in Genesis 2 and 3 has a different God and a different author than Genesis 1. The two gods even have different names in the Hebrew. Thirdly, this story was created in a patriarchal culture and does not seek to subvert patriarchy. Indeed, it's frequently used as a tool to denigrate women and women's authority and leadership. So it's not a good news story for women. Fourthly, there are inconsistencies in the story that a smart teenager, like many of the smart teenagers that we have at St. Luke's, might try to trip up their youth leader with. Like if humans were made in the image of God, And let's suppose for a minute that might include the thirst for and curiosity about knowledge. Would not the all-knowing deity have foreseen that they would be interested in a tree called the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Similarly, if you make a desirable chocolate cake, put it in front of Glynn and tell him not to eat it, especially when you, the creator deity, have made Glynn's taste buds addicted to chocolate, that would be a setup. And this garden and apple scenario is a setup. The humans are getting played. The talking snake, who, by the way, was more truthful in his dealings with the humans than the deity, like the humans didn't die after eating apple, did they? The snake was also played by God. Why do we blame the snake? Why do we blame the woman? If the omniscient deity knew all this, why don't we just blame God? Or why blame anyone or anything? Let me explain the why blame anyone comment. I suggest we think about the meta-narrative that is present in this story. There's a narrative that says the world was created very good. Yes, I think the world is very good. But there are some things about the world, including the non-human world, that you could argue are very bad. Think natural disasters, floods, fire, earthquakes. They make mess. What about crop failures and famines? Are humans solely to blame for this? Then the Genesis meta-narrative says humans were made in the image of God. Some argue, of course, like Lloyd Gehring, that it was the other way around, that we made God with our projections, ideals, etc. But even if we can figure out what it means to be made in the image of God, there's an inference that other non-human life isn't made in God's image and is therefore inferior, which has led to all sorts of exploitations and extinctions. Next, the meta-narrative says something went wrong and so we suffer. What went wrong is labeled in the myth as disobedience. And the assumption is that obedience will be the pathway to return to that very good original state. We just need to be good girls and boys, stop being curious and questioning, and do as we are told. Just like totalitarian governments advocate. Was there a perfect time in ancient history when the world was very good and then got messed up? Or was the world always messy? Is our yearning to clean up the mess a yearning to return to an imaginary original goodness? Or just a yearning to make things better than they are? And then who is to blame for the mess? Genesis 2 begins with blaming the snake, the woman, and the man. But quickly the narrative expands to encompass most, maybe all, of humankind. Really? Are we inherently bad? Are all humankind original sinners? There is a big mental and spiritual health legacy from this Genesis meta-narrative, including blame, guilt, retribution, low self-esteem, and the idea that we'll only be loved and accepted by God and others if we do better, and we consistently do better. Well, the theology of radical grace says otherwise. Radical grace says that we are already and always been loved and accepted by God. that God never cast us out of any Eden, and that God has never and will never leave us. Radical grace drives a stake through this Genesis myth. Not that I don't think temptations exist. And I'm not talking about chocolate. In fact, there's been a move, probably in response to piety of the past, to trivialize the word temptation. But here's 12 couplets about temptation that you might want to think about. There is the temptation to do nothing, and then temptation to think you always have to do something. There is the temptation to think doing gets things done, and the temptation to think being still doesn't. There's the temptation to think that it all depends on me. The temptation to think nothing depends on me. There's the temptation to do only what we think will succeed. And the temptation to heed self-doubt so that we never try. There is the temptation to apportion blame when things go wrong, and the temptation to forget the lessons from our mistakes. There is the temptation to equate success with blessing, and the temptation to equate failure with curse. There is the temptation to think of sickness as somehow morally bad, and the temptation to think of health as somehow morally good. There is the temptation to think that money brings happiness, and the temptation to think that going without can't. There is the temptation to think that my suffering is paramount, and the temptation to think that the suffering of others can be justified. There is the temptation to think that prayer is what we say and do, and the temptation to think that we know how to pray. There is the temptation to take for granted the love we receive, and the temptation to think that love has to be earned. There is the temptation to think we know what love is, and the temptation to not answer when grace knocks. Every blessing to you and all those you love this week.